Another way of thinking about what we're discussing here is that when people are communicating with other people, in person or via some kind of media, what is the basis of why they're communicating? What is the actual motive or agenda or ordinating basis of that communication? Because it is a shared thing. There's an interpersonal thing happening. Is the communication for the interpersonal benefit, for the benefit of those people and the larger wholes that they're part of in the ecology and whatever? Is it for some private benefit? Is the motive being shared? Is it not being shared? These are important inquiries, and humans are smart. And we have a world where there are ways where we can advantage ourselves at the expense of others. There are ways where the expense to other can be hidden so we have plausible deniability on it, or seems diffuse to a lot of people so it doesn't seem that bad, or seems rationalizable because if I don't, some other bad thing will happen. So there's a lot of reasons why someone can even feel moral and right by doing something to be self-serving that involves sharing something that is to some degree distorted, meaning not true or not the whole truth in a representative way or whatever. I don't think the history on this is clear. I think there's still a good bit of debate on theories of it. Gelman and Girard and various thinkers on the history of linguistics have different thoughts on the evolution of spoken language and then formalizations of spoken language. But I think it's pretty clear that language did not evolve just based on individual selection. It was that groups survived better based on their ability to share information and coordinate better, i.e. to share sense-making. I went and I saw where the predator was or where the berries were or where the water was, and I come back and share. So the ability for the people to share their sense-making and then to be able to coordinate that has a group intelligence that is better than just the individual intelligences, that their ability to communicate created groups that survive better so than those individuals that did effective communication within groups did. So it's a group selection phenomena more than an individual selection phenomena, which means that the evolution of language was actually for the survival of the group. This is something that Landry's done a lot of work on. And yet today we share communication very often in self-serving ways, not for the benefit of the group, but for the benefit of self, or self and some proxy, some fealty relationships like family or political side or company or nation or whatever it is. But that's still self and group I identify with in context of externalize harm to some other group that's also connected to our context. But even just in personal relationships, and if you just look on Facebook, the amount of sharing that is self-serving through language, when I think language actually evolved as a collective intelligence tool, is a real underlying fundamental problem. And I think then, to the degree we do it, it leads to everyone doing it, leads to a multipolar trap that leads to a broken epistemic commons and information ecology where almost nobody actually trusts anyone or thinks really well or communicates in earnest, effective shit that empowers each other. I would like, when I'm communicating, to share things that actually empower you to be more sovereign, not that try to capture your sovereignty so that you believe and do in service of what I want. Right? And I think the reason that we're sharing these videos is actually not trying to say, this is my worldview, believe it, but to say, this is the way that anyone selling a worldview, including where I'm selling worldviews in other places, can have distortion, intentionally or unintentionally. So how do you better equip yourself to notice that?
Including the worldviews that we're selling to ourselves?
Including the worldviews we're selling to ourselves, and yeah, like the distortion is to self most of the time. And that's actually why I said one of the things that good sense-making requires is a lot more courage, but also a lot more humility. Because one of the main problems is faulty overconfidence. And then there is a failure on the other side, which is to simply embrace not confidence, but give up on sense-making. I got no idea what the fuck's going on. I'm playing video games. Or I got no idea what's true, so I'm going to vote for a strongman leader that I think will at least protect me in war. Right? So we can see the number of Russian citizens that say that they think Putin is lying, even to them, in the news, but also still support him. Because they don't think that truth is a possibility, and that a good, strong politician facing huge opponents and enemies like the West has to lie. And they at least think that he's going to keep them safe and serve their interests better than some other people would. And so you can see there, when people's epistemic certainty is low and they don't know how to make good choices for themselves or what's true, they start defecting to wanting strongman leaders more. We see this in the US right now. You can also see that because strongman leaders know that, helping to decrease everyone's epistemic certainty is actually in their interest. And that will always lead in the direction of dictatorship towards despotism. And if we want anything like a more democratic or more republic process where more people are engaged in their own governance, they have to do the sense-making to be able to meaningfully engage with other people that they are going to be bound with. And if you don't want to, and you don't commit to do what it takes to be actively informed and civically engaged, then you consent to be ruled by those who seek to rule. If you are willing to just adopt belief systems based on who the dominant group think closest to you that seems to serve your interests is, then you are consenting to be ruled and to the descent towards that particular kind of dictatorship. And if you want something like a democratized process, democracy doesn't mean voting. It means a process by which more people are engaged in their own governance, of which voting is one tool. But the Founding Fathers said voting is the death of democracy. I forget, I think it was Jefferson said it, because the democracy really meant, can more of us engage in better conversations than the monarch says what happens, right? Or the whatever kind of rulership there is. And to the degree we have a town hall where we have an actual good, earnest dialectic conversation, we might not even need to vote because we come up with something where we all agree that's a good idea. And the vote is, if we can't, to sublimate physical warfare with a voting warfare, right? But it's actually a warfare where some people are now actually unhappy with the way the whole thing is moving forward, but they at least think that still participating with that system is better than defecting on it and going into war, so they're willing to do it and try again in the next 4 years, right? Or whatever the next thing is. But if we want something other than despotism, the only way to check power... Actually, this is an important point that I would like to make in closing. Anyone who has asymmetric power, whether that's more money or political power or cultural influence or whatever, and usually those come together, right? More money also means that I can buy cultural influence through media and marketing and paying other people to say things that are aligned with what I want, and being able to pay lobbyists and campaign budgets to get political power. So we can just talk about power itself and all of those as expressions. Those who have more power within a power asymmetry both have the incentive and the capacity to maintain that power asymmetry and increase it. So they have the ability to make news that does the bidding of that has the populace believe things that continue to serve them having more power in that system. They can get representation, they can create technologies, they can corner markets, they can, whatever it is, corner scarce resources that allow them to continue doing that. They can suppress opponents. So this is why we see that sometimes after a war, things will be kind of leveled. The playing field will be a bit leveled, and then whoever starts to get ahead will start to see this increasing wealth inequality and power asymmetry until we get this power law distribution that is so extreme that it actually doesn't work for the base, and then there's war again, or some kind of breakdown. But I don't think we get to make it through that process more at the level of technological development that we have. And I think we need to do something fundamentally other than that. So we have to say, why is it that that power law distribution is inexorable, right? That the inequalities keep getting more intense. And people argue against it, and their arguments, typically those who are at the top of the power law distribution argue against it as a kind of apologism. And they'll say, no, technology democratizes power because look at these new entrepreneurs who weren't born into old money and they got power. okay, I can use edge cases to actually prove a rule. But so the internet was supposed to decentralize, be a great equalizer and decentralize broadcast media, where there were, a handful of major news outlets where they were the only people that could share their idea. And now with YouTube, anybody could. And MySpace, Facebook, everybody could. But then, of course, what it means is you've got Google and Facebook that own pretty much all of the platform for the online capacity to broadcast anything, that have way more centralized power than any of those news stations previously had. And so the technology that supposedly was going to decentralize it, you remember that revolvers were going to be a great equalizer in a similar way, right? The technology that's supposed to decentralize the power asymmetry will eventually end up getting captured to create a more intense power asymmetry, because the technology equals more power, and that ends up being captured by those who are better at doing the more power thing. The only way out of that I know of is a radically empowered, in a healthy and effective way, base. That, because otherwise we say, okay, well, that's not possible, so we can't really have everyone engaged because people are too lazy and stupid and unwilling and whatever, and so we need to at least just pick better representatives. The representatives will do a good job. We'll create a thing called a state that is going to regulate and bind the predatory aspects of market. So the market can't cut down the trees in the areas we call state parks, and they can't do organized crime even though it's profitable, and they can't, whatever, dump all their stuff in the drinking water. And so we're going to create regulatory bodies that that bind the market. So then the market's primary goal is to capture those regulatory bodies, right? Anyone who's doing well in the market that is going to do less well if the regulators are successful, their primary agenda is to debase the integrity of the regulator. And they can do that with legislation, because the lobbyists are lawyers that have to be paid for by somebody, and who has the money to pay them is the corporate interests. The campaign budgets have to be paid for by somebody. The campaign budgets of your opponent will get a lot of, support, and you've only got 4 years in office. Blah, 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 right? So it's very easy to see how the market ends up capturing the regulatory forces to then end up doing their bidding. So now we have banks that get bailed out when they actually should go bankrupt, and oil companies that are subsidized. Like, that's not a market. What the fuck? And that's also not the healthy kind of binding the predatory aspects. That's a crony capitalist type thing. So if the regulators are supposed to be able to bind the market type dynamics, where the predatory parts of the market, they got asymmetric power over everybody else. Well, who is it that's going to check the regulators? Well, the accountability of the representatives to the people, where the people are actually educated, aware, engaged enough to be able to do that, is supposedly the idea, which is why in the founding of, the United States, and we can look at examples in other attempts at a democratized process, said, we've given you a republic if you can keep it, and the foundation will be the comprehensive education and engagement of all the citizens. George Washington said the most important part of education will be studying the science of government, not STEM. STEM makes people who are great weapons, but doesn't make people who can see where the system is being weaponized, right? Studying history and politics and those dynamics so that people can do civic engagement is where that would happen. So you see how much the study of the humanities and civics in the versions that would be relevant for this got cut after World War II. STEM and law got much more focus. The version of the humanities that got left was a version that actually couldn't fight the dominant system effectively at all, because it goes against itself, which is a particular kind of virulent postmodernism. Not to say that there aren't relevant parts of postmodernism, but it is not the kind that can actually check forces. And so you can see that in World War II, there were a few really smart STEM guys that were super helpful, right? Von Neumann and Turing and Feynman and whatever. So we wanted to find all of them, create SATs and standardized tests to find them and train them in that way so that they would be effective tools or weapons towards the system. And we didn't want smart guys thinking about different systems like Marx or, whatever. So we wanted to make sure that those who were going to study the classics and the humanities were typically the kids of the elites who went to nice private prep schools, went to an Ivy League, and then came into the position to do that thing. How much of that was intended versus just the emergent property of the system? Because seeing Sputnik said, wow, not studying enough science is a real national security threat. It doesn't matter. How much it was just a strange attractor phenomena versus strange attractor that was then noticed and acted on, doesn't really matter. But Asymmetries of power have the orientation to and capacity to increase themselves.